Thank you for your very generous and helpful comments. I want to say very little so that we can have a conversation with the audience. Very briefly, of course, Protestantization or Protestantism is not specific to Bible and Jewish studies. I think it's across disciplines, across humanities and social sciences. So thank you for that correction. Secondly, I didn't mean to suggest for a moment that Philosemitism is not isn't always disingenuous. I have in mind Kuhn, Wellhausen, Note, and actually people I studied with. I've been really quite careful about not naming my very particular experience, both with respect to colleagues and with respect to my own teachers. Third, I'm not really prepared to live with the limitation that you describe as an historian. I mean, I think this is a very important distinction between what the two of us have done. To report on the history of the development of 18th and 19th century academy and our willingness, our delight in Lessing's inclusion of the Jewish voice as opposed to Kant's silencing of Jewish voice is very different than my standing and saying, I'm not prepared to continue to teach a narrative of Wellhausen to my students as dogma, as a Jew and as an intellectual. And that's what I protest. And this is why I grant that many of the models that I offer today, some were, I think, perceivable or accessible to some more than others, depending on whether or not you were a philosopher, an historian, or, we have, ancient Jewish philologists of ancient Judaism in the room. And I think, different people got access to different models that I was offering. I'm not drawing at straws or, kind of searching around in the dark, but I am trying to find a variety of models that can help us move forward. And I don't think it's okay to say, well, that's just the way it is in the Christian world or in the non-Jewish world, which I've actually heard colleagues of mine say here, what else do you expect? I expect a lot more. This is about me functioning as a human being in the academy, not particularly as a woman, but also as a woman, not particularly as a Jew, but also as a Jew. And I think that this is part of what I took on from the very beginning. The last thing is, in brief, is just to say that the situating of Jewish studies more broadly, in the context of the world that you describe, I found to be enormously enriching and helpful. And I think ultimately, and this goes back to many conversations I've had with Professor Uri, it's really about, we need to put ourselves in conversation with the history of the development, but also understand that we're doing also something new. There's something innovative and fresh about the work we do, and it presupposes an existence of whatever we mean by Wissenschaft des Judentums or Madei Yahadut. And I think that's a very, very different world than the world you're describing. Okay, thank you.
Okay, the floor is open.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. And I can really empathize with your feelings coming from Orthodox Jewish background into the academy and with studies. And also I think that your general view of where the field should come to is more and more becoming more and more common, especially among the young generation of scholars. But I would like to ask you about when we take your conclusions into discipline of history, when we try to learn first temple Israelite Jewish or second temple Judaism, then you will still have to consider the original state of text, not only its transmission or the way it was
Yeah, so thank you. So first, as I even uttered my formulation and looked around the room, I felt that there were a number of people in the room, including yourself, Eshbal, Yedida, Yishai, other people who work in kind of classical Jewish texts who are pushing the field forward and really, creating new openings in ways that I can't, and in ways that are very exciting to me. That's the case that we're working together, and there's a much larger community of people. Secondly, I embrace the second part of your question less. I think that you're still formulating it in terms of recovering an Ur text or an original Israel, the world of Albright or Frank Moore Cross. I don't think that that's the way we use text to reconstruct history. I think we use cultural context, and I think I would want to really problematize the way you use the term history and think about critical evaluations of history from the standpoint of the field of history. Now, what we mean by history or historiography, what can we actually learn from these texts, and what can we learn from the material evidence that we match up to it? It's the language of fragmentariness, and it's also the language of what exactly you're trying, not you, but what is one trying to recover when they recover the Beit David inscription and then celebrate, the monarchy. It's not just a religious celebration, but it's also a religious celebration. It's how we do ancient history. So I'm not only thinking about figures such as Hayden White and Vane, but I'm also thinking about current discourses like Chris Kraus, who's written about Livy and Thucydides, and saying we can't really do that kind of history. We have to be a little understanding history as a kind of interpretive project, which is not history but historiography, and then to go back to a distinction, borrowing from Hilary Putnam about fact-value distinctions and what we can recover. We can recover narratives in the same way that you write about pluriformity with respect to the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think we can have plura-historical, multi. They're historians in the room, so I'm sure they have better ways of formulating this. There are narratives about reconstructing, for example, 38 in Alexandria, the so-called first pogrom. And I think we have to be far more humble about the work that we do as historians. But I still think it should be done. Okay.
Hindy, I'm totally sympathetic in general, not really in the context of biblical studies, the idea of prospective history, of the role of the historian is reconstructing history as it unfolded, as opposed to sort of reverse engineering the final product and trying to say, the patchwork by which it was made of. Of course, prospective history requires assumptions about agency, about what the people producing the text felt was wrong or lacking, or could be better in what they had in hand, and therefore trying to explain the next step, right? Ezra 2, against the backdrop of what they had in hand. And of course that's a very, very different type of narratology than the reverse engineering sort of prying apart, looking for the seams and trying to see how they were put together. But is there a way, or could you give us an example of a prospective project in biblical studies? Post-biblical studies, I understand. You're working away from the Old Testament into the Second Temple material, and viewing this as the produce of people who are seconding Moses or whatever, and forging. But in terms of the investigation of the biblical canon itself, of the Hebrew Bible, how do you go about prospective history?
Okay, so I was asked to use the mic, but let me just draw something on the board. So first of all, the first thing, which has nothing to do with the arrows, is just to say, first of all, thank you for the question. I first want to problematize the second part of your question, and then I want to try to answer the first part. So as many people who know my work in the room, I don't really believe in biblical, post-biblical categories. I'm using those categories for the sake of ease and transparency. The canon is a very late construct. There are multiple forms of canon or authoritative literature in antiquity, and the problems that we know of in contemporary settings with respect to canon are operative not only for rabbinic literature and kind of retrospective constructs from the Gaonic period backwards, but also with respect to what you've called Bible or Hebrew Bible and post-biblical texts. The development, there are many examples which I could give you, but first I just want to say that what you called kind of the growth or the development of text moves backwards and forwards. That is, later texts recreate precursors, so there's movement kind of back and forth as we kind of stretch and develop both backwards and forwards with respect to the creating of figure and texts. And then there's also a kind of intermingling of texts. I'm trying to kind of describe it how they kind of write within and also write as they grow and expand. These traditions grow and expand. There's so many examples. I mean, there are examples that are local and there are examples that are bigger. So whether we're going to talk about something like the collection of Psalms, and we know that there's not a definitive collection, not with respect to titles and not with respect to which members are in and which members are out. And we know this because of non-canonical Psalms that are included in collections at Qumran, and some of these texts find their way into texts like Ben Sira or in the early Greek editions of Psalms. But there are also endings, different endings within what you would call the biblical collection, which shows ongoing growth and reflection, or interruption, ruptures within the collection, which seems to suggest that they're endings within a collection that you now call canonical, which is nothing but a medieval construct, an important medieval construct, but a medieval construct nevertheless. We could talk about the Jeremianic versions that we know of, that they're bigger and smaller. Well, we see the growth, and the prospective account is the ongoing growth and addition of examples of Psalms even after there's already a collection that's mentioned, and we continue to add more Psalms to that collection. But we can also go back and watch the assembly of whole Psalms that really belong into constituent parts or separated out, right? A Psalm that has embedded within it 2 or 3 different Psalms that we call a single Psalm. So what we call source critical work as one approach to reading is a very important way of reading that's embedded within what you call biblical and post-biblical texts. I don't think that we stop doing source critical analysis once we close a canon. We continue to do this across time. I've tried to talk about precursors, that is, as we look at later developments of texts, we look back at them and we read them differently, and this borrowing from T.S. Eliot and Borges, but I think this is enormously helpful to understand the ways in which later biblical writers, and the prospective approach, by the way, we can tease out what we understand to be quote-unquote intention. I'm not sure it's terribly productive, and I wouldn't want to use that term. That's a quick, it's kind of a cheap and easy way of answering your question. I would rather think about historical context for thinking about the growth and transformation of what we mean by trauma, what we mean by revelation. So, for example, I've looked at anything from the Pythia and the Delphic Oracle to different notions of, revelation that you find in a text like Josephus or other classical models, as well as Jewish models that represent that. So we can compare it, but then we also are going to problematize the history of the development of these texts as we look at the Ein Sof of the Sof HaNevuah. That was, obviously I mean that in a playful way, but it continues to grow and it continues to unravel on you. I can give you more specific examples, like for example in the book of Deuteronomy, that was a great one to kind of ravel and unravel, and then we would want to also problematize the kind of people that do fortschreibung, right? They give you multiple layers within a single book and ask how productive is that as a mode of thinking about the history of the development of the text, and ultimately at the end of the day, is our goal to read, is our goal to interpret, is our goal to reconstruct, the original moment in time. And I think what I want more than anything else is just for us to be transparent about our goal being one of a series of goals, and to understand that the production and composition is over long periods of time, and that everything we do is untimely. you asked in English, and I really want to answer in Hebrew. לימדתי בתיכון לשנתיים, וחשבתי, זה היה בית ספר דתי, וחשבתי כל הזמן, עוד לא התחלתי את ה-PhD שלי, אבל זה היה בבוסטון, וכבר ידעתי that I would go on and do kind of historical critical work. And I kept getting stuck. So I kept getting, I kept getting stuck on what was the real Beit El. And the students would ask me, what do I do? How would I both, without being apologetic, explain the situation? But I remember struggling, because at the same time, there was a parallel high school that had started, and people like Mark Bretler, a biblicist, was insisting that his students be teaching in high school source criticism. Right? And this is the same problem with rabbinics. You know, how are you teaching these traditions? And I want to say that there are two parochialisms, and the misguided, you know, there are two really important mistakes. Number one, when they're teaching in high school, they teach canonically, right? So they're canons that are being taught, which are also theological constructs. And secondly, they're teaching this new move is to teach historical criticism as the correct way to read texts, as though that's another dogma, but in the name of science. So you want to expose them to real history. I think what we need to do is understand, and this goes back to your wonderful comment. This is where, you know, intellectual history, I mean, you do other kinds of history as well, but a kind of intellectual history with respect to the history of understanding of what Judaism is enormously helpful to us. To understand what the biases are. If we can teach these texts in the history, and can you really do this in a high school? And I think the answer is probably not. But can you teach, okay, maybe a little sipur, and then we'll move on to another question. I remember once sitting, my daughter's now 18, she was about 10 at the time, and we were sitting at the table on Shabbat, and someone said about what God wrote in the book of Deuteronomy, and she looked at me and she said, God didn't write that book, Moses did. And my husband looked at me and said, are you going to take that one, Hindy? And I said, no, I'm good. So I kind of want to say that little story is an important story, because it's a story that we allow people to ask the question at the right level, and as teachers at all levels, we have to allow our students to grow pedagogically, but also to think through in a very rigorous way the kind of work that's being done on the history of scholarship, and not to allow ourselves to be co-opted by a theological narrative which is not our own. I mean, this is my biggest problem, is when I find scholars defending a narrative which is co-opted by, yes, of course, I didn't really respond to you, and I didn't say, yes, is there something worse than supersessionism? Of course there is. You know, but supersessionism is also a narrative that we don't have to accept in the context of A, teaching our own texts, and B, reading practices. We have reading practices, and they're extraordinarily interesting. To say that pshat versus drash, right, or literal versus midrash are two competing categories in the history of Judaism is to be profoundly confused about what context is, and to allow ourselves, as many Americanists have written about, to be Protestantized Jews. So let's be very, very careful when we use these two terms like pshat and drash, or to think that you can read text without context, or at least without suggesting that there are multiple contexts. Midrash is not absurd. Midrash is about the history of the life of the text, and it needs to be understood in its own context, and then we need to ask Eshbal's question again about what do you do historically with Joshua's narrative about Abraham, about Avraham, and Terach. Okay.
So I had in this theme, one of the things I wrote throughout the entire talk, which I enjoyed also all our conversations today. Yeah, all our conversations today. This theme of emancipation runs throughout your entire talk. It's all self-emancipation, it's collective emancipation, it's emancipation with the text and contra the text. And at the same time, you're talking about emancipation, you're also very rooted in, I felt, rooted in, you came up right here in response to David's comments, question, you're very rooted in a Wissenschaft Jewish studies tradition, our text, what we think. Our and the we is implicit, I think I understood it correctly. And so this is the very problem of Wissenschaft of Jewish studies for the past years. So is it really an emancipatory project? And how we make and can it be an emancipatory project if we're still within that discourse? And so how do you break through that juggernaut? How do you both remain in Jewish studies and emancipate yourself from its built-in problems?
So I think that's the hardest part of the paper, hope came up at the end, and freedom and hope came up at the beginning, and then there was another moment where I suggested the language of freedom. I think the answer is I don't know. I mean, I think to stand between two parochialisms, right, the parochialism of the history of scholarship by which we're co-opted, and to stand in a tradition, even if one says one's standing outside of the tradition, to teach the texts within the history of that development is still, in some important sense, to be co-opted. I think to stand between a rock and a hard place is also not to be able to stand. So I think that there are new possibilities and new trajectories that we try to create and we try to think through. I think the most important place, location of freedom for me is in conversation with the other, by which I don't mean non-Jew, I mean classicist or Germanist or philosopher, because it's in that space where people are not burdened, let's say, by these two parochialisms, even though they may also, as was said, they still may be part of this discourse. We can step outside of other disciplines and learn from them and figure out how to translate some of that. So in a colleague that Ellie's bringing, Kirk Wetters, we taught a whole bunch of texts together. He was writing on Goethe's Orphic primal words, and that was enormously important for me because of the way Goethe used and transformed classics and biblical studies in his own work, but also because of the way in which Goethe refused to finish his poem. and this became a discourse of perfection, or the impossibility of achieving perfection, which then maps onto the whole history of wisdom literature.
So, I'm going to follow up. Can this emancipation take place in Israeli academia, Jewish studies, or can all of them take place in kind of like a more neutral sphere?
I don't think that this is, so I understand, and I'm sympathetic with people who live here and work here and feel that emancipation is not possible, but I think that so I don't think the constraints, not living here and not working here, but I don't think the constraints that I've experienced through my colleagues who live here, although they're distinctive, if I can make this distinction, I'll ask Ellie Friedlander if I can make this distinction. I want to say that it's not, I want to say that your experience is distinctive, but it's not actually different from the struggles that we have in the academy kind of writ large. And I think whatever tradition, I'm in Oxford now, I spent a fair amount of time in Yale or in Toronto, there were different kinds of constraints of parochialism, racism, and social and political challenges. Yours are different and distinctive, but I think the emancipation of which I speak, I also taught at Notre Dame, right? So the distinctions that we're calling upon here, it's the work of the academy and the work that we need to do. Otherness, that conversation with otherness happens across your colleges or your departments here. That's what I'm calling for. Perhaps the challenge, I mean, it's different. I don't think it's harder, Scott. Okay. Yeah. But it requires to step beyond particularity. Right. Yeah.
So I'll ask. So you have basically two kind of critiques. If we take E.P. Sanders and Forsyth, for example, you have the ideological one, supersessionism, etc., and then the methodological, and then naive concept of urtext. And so my question is, how do you conceptualize the relationship between them? Not in historical terms, but in conceptual terms. Are they dependent, and is there a more profound problem and then an epiphenomenon?
So I think the example of E.P. Sanders is, I deliberately tried to choose an integrated example that I had thought about, which is both ideological and methodological. As I was, Eshbel had to leave, but part of my response to her, I was trying to think of examples of texts, and also in response to Menachem's question, of examples of source critical work that it's not ideological. I mean, I think if you read, for example, I taught recently the Sipur of Noach, right, 6 to 9 in Sefer Breshit. it's impossible for me to teach this, and I say this very deliberately, it's impossible for me to teach it without understanding an assembly of sources. I'm not interested in reconstructing earlier sources or publishing the Book of J. Those of you that don't know, someone actually did that once, named Harold Bloom. But I do think that, that one can do this, and I don't think in my reading of the Noah pericope I'm in any way privileging one part over the other, and I do understand it to be a whole composition. I think my critique of I can be permitted also to decouple that work, to decouple the ideological work from the methodological. So when we can decouple it, I then want to really challenge, this is the thing that's most exciting to me right now, is to think with someone like Peter Sandy and to understand new modes of reading. He's not new, but we really haven't been reading him in biblical studies or Jewish studies. And I think one of the things that he does really beautifully is talk about organic processes with respect to composition. So I'm thinking about methodologically what's wrong with, what am I critical about with respect to source criticism as the most important or the best way of reading. I don't think it's the best way of reading. I think it's a mode of reading that works in some texts. Years ago, Yishai and I were talking about different editions of Hechalot, Schaeffer's edition of Hechalot, and what he did with Yerushalmi. And a very, very important thing that Yishai said to me then, and it's so right, and I've used it so many times, he said it's not a one-size-fits-all or not a one-dog-pony trick, right? Like there's not one way to set up a critical edition. It works beautifully, said Yishai Rosenzweig, with Hechalot, but it's a disaster with Yerushalmi, right? You said that? Yeah. So, and I say this and I repeat it because you know, when we're reading text, I think Fourth Ezra is a beautiful unity, which has an account of Bildung within it, an account of, you know, using kind of Cavalian notions of perfectionism. It works perfectly, you know, or even these earliest accounts of, earlier accounts drawing on, you know, Marcus Aurelius and the kind of conversations about perfectionism and Pierre Hadot, with, you know, et cetera, with antiquity. It really works. Whereas source criticism cuts the text up and it fails. It fails reading. Whereas there are modes of source critical reading to understand the shape and the growth of Sefer Dvarim or Ezra Nehemiah. You can't read it without understanding that it's assembled in different ways. But can we bring different methods to bear, and can we learn from what's happening now in literary criticism? And I said this also, I'm sorry to kind of put it right back on you. You don't have to respond, Yishai. But you know, Yishai wrote a very, very important kind of afterword to Boyarin's, the Hebrew edition of Boyarin's intertextuality. And what I said to Yishai was that what he's doing is not writing an afterword, but rethinking a new mode of thinking about interpretation after Boyarin. And I think it's our responsibility now to think in more, it's not more progressive, but in new ways about what to do with Kristeva and that whole tradition. And so methodologically, I think I'm much more excited than exposing. This is why I said, you know, great. So yes, we expose, you know, elements of Philosemitism that are disingenuous. They're not all disingenuous. We talk openly about the problematics connected to supersessionism, and we're explicit about it, and we worry about it, and we think about it, whether it's Lessing and Kant, whether it's Kuhn and Wellhausen, whether it's Note, right after the Shoah, before the Shoah. These are really important conversations. But the creative work, I think, starts when we put Hebrew and Greek back together, or we re-engage this conversation, which is so important to me, which happened in the Whitney Humanities Center, which is where Boyarin's intertextuality book was born in Yale. It's no longer vibrant in the same way, but this conversation between Budak and Hartman. And I think this is a conversation that we must have with scholars now in classics on the one hand and literary criticism on the other, where we can learn from them, but they also want to learn from us. And this, also the urgency, if there is an urgency, it's because, you know, rabbinic texts and biblical texts also need to be relevant to the history of the humanities. But I do want to decouple it, because I don't think that reading practices, I don't think everyone who did source criticism or everyone who's engaged intertextuality, which, as Glenn Most pointed out to me, is just a deeply deconstructive, not a creative way of reading. And I don't mean that everyone who's used it does it that way. And I don't think that Boyarin meant it in a destructive way in intertextuality at all. But I think it has been used to reinforce a discourse of deconstruction. And I'd like to think about ways of reading that are prospective and retrospective. And I think we have a lot to learn from our other disciplines in the humanities. Is that, yeah. The ideological piece it needs to be rethought. And I also want to say that people who are thinking with Christianity, whether it's the Paul Project or, or it's other the Goy Project that you've been writing. I think we must continue to think and rethink what we do with the history of the development of Christianity and how it's both intimately separate with respect to Judaism, as I used that phrase once to describe someone like Philo of Alexandria, who's writing before there's really a parting of the ways, and there are elements that justify, whatever justify means, him being called Philo-Christianos by someone like Tertullian, even though of course he's a Jew and of course he's deeply embedded in Jewish law and Jewish interpretation. And how to understand that. Perhaps I also want to unravel the ideological question. And this goes back to your point. I don't think it's all perverse, right? I don't think that ideological reading has to be perverse if we understand what it's doing and we can locate it and contextualize it in a way that's responsible to the text and the history of the development. What we don't want to do is rewrite the history of Christianity as though it wasn't supersessionist. And this is very important. I don't want to change the field or change the narrative. I do want to change the field, what I mean is that I don't want to change a narrative so that it's no longer an honest narrative.
Okay, on this note.